The day had begun quietly on the outer edge of explored space. The stars shone brightly, and the small human colony on the mining planet seemed calm, almost peaceful. For most people, it was just another ordinary day of work. Miners went about their routines. Transport shuttles carried supplies from one station to another, and engineers checked the equipment that kept everything running. But for the young officer, the day felt different. There was a strange tension in the air, a sense that something big was about to happen. The officer had been assigned to a new mission, one that seemed simple on the surface. The humans had discovered a planet with unusual minerals that could be vital for their technology. The mission was straightforward: explore the planet, collect samples, and ensure there were no dangers. At least, that was what everyone thought. The officer reviewed the maps and satellite images with a sense of excitement. Humanity had been exploring space for decades, but each new planet still brought a mix of curiosity and fear. Some planets were empty and harmless, while others hid dangers that could end a mission in minutes. This one seemed quiet. Too quiet. The landing was smooth, almost too smooth. The shuttle touched down on the rocky surface, kicking up clouds of red dust. The officer stepped out first, scanning the horizon. The landscape stretched endlessly, jagged rocks and cliffs creating strange shadows. There was no sign of life, no movement, no animals, no alien structures. Only the minerals they had come to collect sparkled under the twin suns. The officer felt a thrill. Humanity was alone here, at least for now. As the team began to collect samples, one of the junior explorers noticed strange markings on the ground. They looked like patterns, almost like symbols, etched carefully into the rock. The officer bent down to examine them. At first, they seemed decorative, maybe natural formations. But the more the officer looked, the more a feeling of unease grew. These markings were deliberate. Someone or something had been here before. The team paused. No one spoke, but the silence was heavy. The officer felt the weight of the unknown pressing in. Despite the unease, the mission continued. The minerals had to be collected, and the samples were carefully stored. But as the officer moved deeper into a rocky valley, a strange energy began to hum in the air. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew stronger with every step. Instruments began to flicker, warning lights blinking urgently. The officer frowned, signaling the team to stop. They were trained for emergencies, for hazards like storms, earthquakes, or malfunctioning equipment, but this felt different. It was as if the planet itself was watching them. Then it happened. Without warning, the ground beneath their feet shifted violently. Rocks tumbled down the cliffs, and a low, resonating sound filled the air. The officer barely managed to shout a warning as the team scattered. In the chaos, one of the junior explorers stumbled into a shallow pit, twisted an ankle, and cried out in pain. The officer rushed over, helping them to their feet. The minerals were forgotten. Survival became the only priority. As they regrouped, a strange figure appeared on a ridge above them. It was unlike anything the humans had ever seen. Tall, muscular, with armor that shimmered under the sun, and eyes that glowed with an intensity that felt almost alive. The figure did not move closer, but its presence was overwhelming. The officer felt a chill run down their spine. They had not expected to encounter life on this planet, much less a species so advanced and imposing. Before anyone could react, a sudden beam of energy shot from the figure, striking a nearby rock and shattering it into pieces. The officer barely managed to pull the injured explorer behind cover. The team froze, realizing the figure was testing them, observing their movements. The officer understood immediately. This was not a friendly encounter. They had stumbled into territory they should never have entered. Every instinct screamed retreat, but the minerals, the mission, and the orders from higher command weighed heavily. They could not leave empty-handed. Desperate to communicate, the officer raised their hands and activated a universal translator, hoping for a peaceful interaction. But the figure responded with a gesture that was impossible to misinterpret. A warning. Leave now or face consequences. The officer nodded, signaling the team to pack up quickly. They had no choice but to retreat, knowing that one wrong move could provoke an attack, but luck did not favor them. As the team turned to leave, one of the drones used to scan the terrain accidentally flew too close to the figure. It hovered in the air for just a second, and that was enough. The figure lashed out, destroying the drone with a single strike. Sparks and metal rained down, and a beam grazed the officer's shoulder. Pain shot through the arm, but the officer forced themselves to stay calm. Panic would only make things worse. The retreat was chaotic. The team moved quickly, keeping low and avoiding open areas. Every step felt dangerous, every shadow a potential threat. The officer glanced back once and saw multiple figures appearing along the cliffs, their movements swift and coordinated. The humans realized with growing horror that this was not a single individual. They had entered a planet controlled by a species, capable of tracking intruders with frightening precision. When the shuttle finally lifted off, the tension did not ease. The officer sat in the cabin, hands shaking slightly, replaying the events over and over. They had survived, but the cost had been high. Equipment was damaged, one team member injured, and a simple mission had turned into a nightmare. The officer could not shake the feeling that this encounter would have consequences far beyond this single mission. They were right. Back on the human command station, the officer reported the incident. Higher command listened in silence as the details were laid out. The strange symbols, the energy attack, the advanced figures, and the destroyed drone. There was a pause, long enough to make everyone uneasy, before the response came. A single chilling message. Humanity had crossed a line, and the species they had encountered was known as the HFY, the most lethal species in the galaxy. What the humans had thought was a minor incident was actually an act of war. The officer felt a heavy weight settle in their chest. They had not intended to start a conflict, but intention mattered little in this universe. The HFY did not forgive mistakes. They did not negotiate lightly. And they did not forget. The officer realized that this day would be remembered, not for the minerals collected, but for the moment humanity unknowingly provoked the deadliest species they had ever faced. As night fell over the command station, the officer looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the HFY were already planning their response. Humanity had just made its first mistake in a war they had not yet understood. The officer knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The galaxy had changed, and humanity was no longer just an explorer. It was a participant in a deadly game where survival was not guaranteed. The team began to recover from the shock, tending to the injured and repairing what they could. The officer stayed awake for hours, reviewing the data, trying to predict what the HFY might do next. Every scenario seemed worse than the last. The species was not only deadly, but intelligent, capable of strategies and tactics that could outmatch human technology. Fear and determination coexisted within the officer. They understood that learning from this encounter, staying calm, and acting wisely would be the only way to survive what was coming. For the first time, the officer felt the full weight of responsibility. They had led their team into danger, and now they would have to face the consequences. Humanity's place in the galaxy was changing, and the officer was at the center of the storm. The minerals, the mission, and the excitement of discovery were all gone, replaced by the harsh reality of a war that had already begun. Sleep finally came, but it was restless and filled with nightmares of glowing eyes, sharp weapons, and an endless galaxy that suddenly felt too small and too dangerous. The officer woke before dawn, knowing that the next steps would define not only their life, but the future of humanity's colonies. The first part of the story had ended, but the real challenge was only beginning. Humanity had just started a war with the most lethal species in the galaxy, and the officer had to survive, lead, and learn quickly if anyone was to make it through the coming storm. The humans had barely recovered from the first encounter when the reality of the situation hit them with full force. The Karthik were not going to wait. Within hours of the report being sent to human command, the first attacks began. Outposts along the border of human-controlled space were suddenly under assault. Explosions lit up the sky, alarms blared across multiple stations, and communication lines buzzed with panicked messages. The humans realized quickly that this species they had accidentally provoked was unlike any enemy they had faced before. The officer watched the attacks unfold from the command center, heart heavy. On the screens, Karthik ships moved with terrifying speed and precision. They didn't waste energy or resources on idle maneuvers. Each strike seemed calculated, almost as if the humans were being studied, tested. Entire defense posts were obliterated before reinforcements could arrive. The officer felt a lump in the throat. This was not a war humans could fight in a traditional way. Their weapons were powerful, but the Karthak technology, combined with their ruthless strategy, made every engagement deadly. Reports kept coming in. Colonists were trapped, supplies were destroyed, and communication with some planets had been completely cut off. The officer knew that human morale would soon begin to collapse if action wasn't taken. Higher command debated endlessly. Some advocated for immediate retaliation, arguing that humans had to show strength or risk being seen as weak. Others cautioned against aggressive moves, warning that any misstep could invite total annihilation. The officer felt torn between the two sides. Survival demanded action, but action demanded courage and intelligence, beyond what most humans had ever faced. The officer decided to take matters into their own hands. They couldn't just sit and watch as the Karthik advanced. Gathering a small team, they began analyzing the enemy's movements, searching for patterns that could be exploited. What the humans discovered was astonishing. The Karthik were predictable in some ways, but their attacks were not random. They adapted quickly, learned from every encounter, and responded to even the smallest human mistake with deadly efficiency. This was not mindless violence. This was a calculated, intelligent species, and humanity had become its target dot as the humans prepared for their first direct confrontation. Fear and anxiety mixed with determination. The officer briefed the team, laying out a plan that relied on speed, stealth, and precision rather than brute force. Every member understood the stakes. They were no longer exploring new worlds or collecting minerals. They were fighting for survival, and failure was not an option. The officer felt the weight of responsibility pressing down, knowing that every decision could mean life or death. The first skirmish was a disaster at first. The humans underestimated the Karthik's ability to anticipate their movements. Ships were hit by energy beams that seemed to appear out of nowhere, and shields were pierced with terrifying accuracy. The officer's heart raced as they maneuvered their ship through the chaos, dodging attacks that would have destroyed anything smaller. Explosions shook the hull, alarms screamed, and the team scrambled to repair damaged systems while still trying to fight back. It was a harsh introduction to the true power of their enemy. Despite the setbacks, the humans learned quickly. They began to notice patterns in the Karthik attacks, certain formations, repeated timing, and predictable responses to specific maneuvers. The officer led small, daring missions to test these weaknesses, sending teams to remote locations to gather intelligence and observe enemy movements. Each success was small but vital. One destroyed supply ship, one damaged command unit, one rescued group of colonists, it all counted. Slowly, the humans began to understand that while the Karthik were lethal, They were not infallible. The officer also discovered something unexpected. The Karthik seemed to value strength and courage. They responded aggressively to hesitation and rewarded decisive action. This insight changed the human strategy. Instead of trying to hide or run from every encounter, the officer instructed teams to engage when it made sense, showing determination and skill. It was a gamble, but it gave humans a psychological edge. They were no longer just reacting. They were beginning to fight on their own terms. Meanwhile, the human colonies suffered. Civilians were terrified, hiding in shelters as attacks became more frequent. Food and medicine became scarce in some areas, and panic threatened to spread faster than the enemy could. The officer visited several colonies personally, walking among the frightened people, offering reassurance, and witnessing firsthand the human cost of this sudden war. It was a bitter reality. Bravery in space wasn't just about fighting. It was about keeping hope alive when the odds seemed impossible. The officer also faced criticism from other leaders. Some accused them of taking too many risks, of being reckless. Others said they weren't aggressive enough, letting the enemy dictate terms. Every decision was scrutinized, but the officer remained focused. They understood that leadership in this war meant balancing caution with boldness, fear with strategy, and logic with intuition. Every choice could mean survival or annihilation, and there was no room for hesitation. As the weeks passed, humans began to adapt further. Engineers developed shields that could withstand brief Karthik energy blasts, while pilots trained to anticipate and counter the enemy's aggressive maneuvers. Humans learned to think like the Karthik, predicting movements, setting traps, and creating diversions. The officer led drills, simulations, and real missions to test these tactics. Each small victory boosted morale, showing that while the Karthik were dangerous, humans were not helpless. The officer also realized the importance of intelligence and information. Teams were sent on reconnaissance missions, often deep behind enemy lines, to observe, record, and report. It was risky work, and not every mission succeeded. Some teams were captured, others barely escaped. The officer felt the weight of each loss, understanding that each person was not just a soldier, but part of a family, a community. Every life lost was a reminder of the stakes. Yet, every mission that succeeded provided valuable insight, slowly giving humans a fighting chance. Amid the chaos, a breakthrough occurred. One human team discovered that Karthik attacks were sometimes delayed when their sensors were confused by specific energy signatures. Another team realized that the enemy's communications relied on certain patterns that could be intercepted or jammed. These discoveries allowed humans to create small but effective countermeasures. The officer was careful not to underestimate the Karthik, but these victories sparked a sense of hope. Humanity was learning. Humanity was adapting. Humanity might survive, but hope was tempered by caution. Every success was hard-won, and the Karthik were relentless. Even as humans repaired outposts and rescued civilians, new attacks came from unexpected directions. It became clear that the enemy had the ability to strike anywhere, at any time, forcing humans to remain constantly alert. Sleep was a luxury, mistakes were deadly, and the margin for error was razor-thin. The officer often stayed awake for hours, studying reports, analyzing tactics, and planning the next moves. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but there was no other choice. One day, the officer received a message from a Karthik ship. It was a simple warning, a brief transmission that made it clear they were aware of the humans' adaptations. The message carried no threat, yet it was terrifying. It demonstrated intelligence, strategy, and awareness. The officer realized that this was not just a battle of weapons. It was a battle of minds. The Karthik were learning, just as humans were learning. The war was no longer about simple survival. It was a test of ingenuity, courage, and resilience. As the officers sat in the command center, watching the stars streak by, they reflected on the cost of this war. Entire colonies had been damaged, thousands of civilians were in danger, and countless soldiers had already fallen. Yet, in the midst of chaos, the officers saw determination. Humans were not giving up. They were adapting, learning, and fighting back. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to keep moving forward. The Karthik were deadly, yes, but humans had something equally powerful: courage and the will to survive. The officer knew that the war was far from over. The first attacks had shown the Karthik's power. The first victories had shown humanity's resilience, but the real test was still ahead. Each mission, each encounter, each strategy would shape the future of humanity in ways that could not yet be seen. The officer understood that the coming months or years would demand every ounce of skill, every shred of courage, and every bit of humanity's ingenuity. And so, as the human fleet regrouped and prepared for the next wave of attacks, the officer made a silent promise. No matter the cost, humanity would survive. They would face the Karthik with intelligence, strategy, and courage. Every loss would be honored, every victory would be built upon, and every human life would be valued. The officer knew that the Karthik were a deadly enemy, but humans had proven one thing already: they did not give up. This was only the beginning. The war had started, and humanity had entered a fight unlike any other in history. The Karthik were lethal, cunning, and relentless. But the humans had heart, determination, and the will to survive. And sometimes that was enough to change the course of the battle. The humans were learning to fight, but they quickly realized that fighting alone would not be enough. The Karthik were too fast, too precise, and too intelligent. Even with careful planning, small victories came at a high cost. Ships were destroyed, colonies damaged, and lives lost. It was clear that humanity could not survive this war without allies. The officer knew this and began pushing for diplomatic action, despite the fear and uncertainty that hung over every conversation. Reaching out to other alien civilizations was not simple. Some had been neutral for centuries, preferring to stay out of human conflicts. Others had their own grudges and ambitions, making negotiations tricky. The officer traveled from station to station, meeting with representatives, explaining the dangers humanity faced, and pleading for support. There were many long hours of discussion, often without agreement. Some leaders were suspicious, asking why humans had provoked the Karthik and whether humanity could be trusted in a war of this scale. But persistence paid off. A few neighboring species agreed to help, though cautiously. They sent advisors, shared intelligence, and provided limited supplies and reinforcements. The officer coordinated carefully, making sure every resource was used strategically. Every new ally meant another chance to survive, another opportunity to protect civilians, and another step toward balancing the scales against the deadly Karthik. It was fragile support, but it was a start. Meanwhile, the Karthik attacks continued. They struck unpredictably, often hitting vulnerable colonies or supply lines. The humans quickly learned that even with allies, they could not simply defend every target. The officer had to make difficult decisions, choosing which locations to defend and which to risk. Every choice carried consequences. Some colonists were angry and fearful, some soldiers frustrated and exhausted. The officer listened, reassured, and sometimes had to give orders that were harsh but necessary. Leadership in a war like this required more than courage. It required sacrifice and tough judgment. During this time, the officer also noticed a surprising development. The Karthik, while aggressive, seemed to respect strategy and intelligence. They reacted strongly when humans executed clever tactics or showed courage in battle. The officer decided to use this to their advantage, planning operations that were not just defensive, but deliberately challenging the enemy's assumptions. Teams carried out small strikes on Karthik patrols, using terrain, speed, and deception to survive encounters. Every success, no matter how small, was celebrated. Morale among humans was fragile, and these victories reminded them why they were fighting. The officer also focused on training. Humans were learning that survival required more than bravery. Pilots practiced maneuvers for hours, engineers developed new shields, and strategists analyzed every skirmish. The officer led simulations to anticipate Karthak attacks, testing every possible scenario. These exercises were exhausting, but they prepared humans for what was coming. They learned to predict enemy movements, set traps, and respond quickly to sudden strikes. Each lesson learned in the field increased the humans' chances of survival. Amid this chaos, the officer personally visited colonies that had been attacked. Walking among civilians who had seen their homes destroyed and their friends injured left a deep impact. Fear was everywhere, but so was resilience. Humans were resourceful and brave, even in the face of near-certain danger. The officer helped organize evacuations, coordinated supply drops, and reassured frightened families. Leadership was not just about directing soldiers in battle. It was about inspiring hope and determination in those who might otherwise give up. Alliances with other species were not without challenges. Cultural misunderstandings and different military approaches caused friction. Some alien allies moved cautiously, while humans wanted to strike aggressively. There were disagreements about priorities, tactics, and how to handle captured Karthik technology. The officer often found themselves mediating, negotiating compromises, and reminding everyone of the bigger picture: survival. Patience, diplomacy, and clear communication became as important as any weapon in the fight against the Karthik. During one tense meeting, the officer received intelligence from an allied scout fleet. It revealed a potential weakness in the Karthik strategy. Their communication lines were centralized, and a coordinated strike could disrupt their command structure temporarily. This discovery changed everything. The officer quickly organized a plan, bringing together human pilots, engineers, and allied forces to strike simultaneously at multiple points. It was a daring plan, risky in every sense, but it offered a chance to shift the balance. The mission was tense from the start. Ships moved through asteroid fields and dodged energy beams, while engineers on command stations worked frantically to maintain shields and communications. The officer coordinated every movement, giving orders, adapting to sudden changes, and keeping the focus on the goal. There were moments of fear when attacks came from unexpected directions, but the humans persevered. For the first time, they felt that they were not just reacting to the car, they were shaping the battle. When the strike finally hit the Karthik communication hub, the results were immediate. Enemy coordination faltered, and attacks slowed. Human and allied forces took advantage, rescuing civilians and pushing back onslaughts that had seemed unstoppable. The officer felt a rare surge of relief and pride. It was a reminder that even against the most lethal species, intelligence, courage, and careful planning could make a difference. But there was no time to celebrate. The officer knew the Karthik would adapt quickly, learning from every mistake and every move. The war was far from over, and every victory came with the risk of retaliation. Humans had to remain vigilant, adaptive, and united. The officer's focus shifted immediately to planning the next steps, ensuring that the lessons from this mission would strengthen future defenses and strategies. Even with small successes, the toll was heavy. Each battle left casualties, damaged ships, and emotional scars. The officer spent nights reviewing losses, checking on injured soldiers, and comforting civilians who had lost homes and loved ones. The human spirit, however, remained resilient. People helped one another, volunteers repaired ships, and engineers devised new tools and defenses. The officer marveled at how quickly humans adapted to unimaginable pressure. Using fear as motivation, rather than letting it control them. In quiet moments, the officer reflected on the nature of this war. It was not simply about survival. It was about learning, adapting, and finding strength under pressure. The Karthik were dangerous and deadly, but they were not invincible. Every mistake the humans avoided, every clever tactic executed, and every alliance carefully managed increased their chances of survival. It was a constant struggle, requiring intelligence, bravery, and patience. But the officer could see progress. The officer also realized that leadership meant more than strategy. It meant empathy, communication, and understanding the fears of those who depended on them. Soldiers, pilots, and civilians alike looked to the officer for guidance, and every word, every decision carried weight. The officer knew that losing hope could be as deadly as losing a battle. By staying calm, making wise decisions, and showing courage, the officer inspired others to do the same. As humans continued to adapt, the Karthak became more unpredictable. Their attacks, once organized and precise, now sometimes faltered, giving humans opportunities to strike back. It was a dangerous dance, each side learning from the other. The officer understood that intelligence, courage, and adaptability were the keys to surviving this war. Technology alone would not win battles. Humans had to be clever, quick, and united. The officer often spent long hours planning for the future. Every skirmish, every small victory, and every mistake was analyzed for lessons. Humans were learning, adapting, and growing stronger despite the fear and devastation around them. The officer took pride in the resilience of humanity and their capacity to survive under pressure. For the first time, it felt as though they might have a real chance against the Karthik. Alliances strengthened slowly. Trust built as humans demonstrated their capabilities, reliability, and determination. Small victories, clever strategies, and coordinated missions proved that humans could fight intelligently, not just bravely. The officer worked tirelessly to maintain these alliances, understanding that unity was humanity's best defense against a species that struck without hesitation and rarely forgave mistakes. The officer also continued to train and inspire their teams. Pilots practiced daring maneuvers, engineers repaired and improved damaged ships, and strategists constantly studied enemy behavior. Every human action was part of a larger effort to survive and fight back. The officer reminded the teams that courage, intelligence, and cooperation were as powerful as weapons in the fight against the HFY. As days turned into weeks, the officer saw hope growing among humans. The fear was still there, but it was balanced with determination. The Karthak remained deadly, but humanity had proven that survival was possible. Every ally gained, every strategy learned, and every victory achieved brought humans closer to understanding the enemy and mastering the challenges of this war. The officer realized that this was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. The humans had learned to survive, but survival alone was not enough. The Karthik were clever, fast, and deadly, and every day brought new attacks and challenges. The officer realized that humanity could not win by following the enemy's moves. They had to think differently, to use creativity, intelligence, and ingenuity to level the playing field. It was not just a battle of strength, but of minds. And humans had something the Karthik could not predict: imagination. The officer gathered scientists, engineers, and strategists in a secure command center. The room buzzed with energy and tension. Everyone understood the stakes. Each person had a unique skill, and the officer relied on them to find unconventional solutions. Discussions lasted hours, sometimes late into the night. Ideas were tested, debated, and refined. No suggestion was too strange, no plan too risky. In the face of a lethal enemy, humans had to be bold. The first innovation came from the engineers. They designed small agile drones capable of moving in ways the Karthek would not expect. These drones could scout enemy positions, distract their ships, and even deliver precision strikes on lightly defended targets. The officer oversaw test flights personally, watching the drones weave through asteroid fields, dodge enemy sensors, and gather data. Every successful test brought hope. Humans were starting to gain the edge through cleverness, not just firepower. Meanwhile, the scientists developed new technology to confuse Karthik sensors. Tiny devices were launched ahead of human fleets, creating false signals that made the enemy misjudge human positions and movements. It was subtle but effective. The officer knew that these small advantages could mean the difference between survival and destruction. Even a minor miscalculation by the Karthek could allow humans to rescue civilians, repair colonies, or strike back strategically. The officer also encouraged unorthodox thinking in the pilots. Instead of following standard formations or tactics, they experimented with unpredictability. Ships moved in zigzags, reversed directions suddenly, and used unexpected angles to attack. The Karthek, accustomed to precise patterns and predictable responses, were thrown off balance. Humans discovered that creativity and boldness could work as weapons almost as powerful as lasers or energy shields. One particularly daring mission involved a small team entering a heavily guarded asteroid belt where the Karthik were stationed. The goal was to gather intelligence and disrupt the enemy's supply lines. Every step was calculated, every move fraught with danger. The officer monitored the operation from the command center, heart pounding as each report came in. The team moved silently, using the terrain, speed, and ingenuity to avoid detection. They succeeded where traditional methods would have failed, bringing back crucial information that helped plan larger operations. The officer began to see a pattern. The Karthek relied heavily on logic, routine, and predictable behavior. Humans, by contrast, could adapt, improvise, and make decisions in ways that the enemy could not anticipate. This realization became the cornerstone of their strategy. Humans did not need to match the Karthek in raw strength. They needed to be smarter, faster, and more creative. Every clever tactic, every unexpected maneuver, added to the humans' growing reputation among allies and enemies alike. As these strategies developed, human morale improved. Pilots, engineers, and soldiers felt a sense of purpose. They were not just reacting to attacks, they were shaping the battle. The officer emphasized teamwork, communication, and trust. Each human action was coordinated with others, ensuring that every plan had the best chance of success. The Karthek were formidable, but humans had ingenuity, adaptability, and courage on their side. These qualities were not weapons, but they were just as powerful. The officer also realized the importance of small victories. Each rescued colonist, each destroyed supply ship, each successful mission added to human confidence. People began to see that even the most dangerous enemy could be challenged. Civilians, soldiers, and allies all contributed in small ways, repairing ships, analyzing data, or supporting operations. The officer understood that war was not just fought on battlefields, but in every effort that kept humanity moving forward. Innovation was not without risks. Some experiments failed, costing ships or equipment. Some strategies backfired, resulting in injuries or casualties. The officer faced criticism from higher command, who sometimes feared the unorthodox methods. But the officer remained steadfast. They knew that conventional thinking would not win this war. Survival demanded creativity, courage, and boldness, even at the cost of mistakes along the way. Each failure was analyzed, each lesson learned, and each next attempt was improved. One night, the officer reviewed a recent engagement where humans had successfully lured a Karthik fleet into a trap using decoy signals and agile drones. The operation had been risky, but it worked. Ships that might have been destroyed were saved, and vital information about enemy strategies was collected. The officer realized that ingenuity had become humanity's greatest weapon. The Karthik were powerful, but they could be outsmarted, misled, and challenged in ways they did not expect. The officer also encouraged collaboration with allied species. Their combined knowledge, technology, and experience created opportunities humans could not have achieved alone. Scientists shared insights, pilots trained together, and engineers exchanged ideas. It was not always easy. Cultural differences and communication challenges caused tension, but the officer managed these conflicts with patience and determination. Every alliance strengthened the humans' capacity to survive and fight back. As the war continued, humans discovered another advantage: unpredictability. Unlike the Karthik, humans were not bound by rigid rules or traditions. They could change plans at the last moment, improvise, and take risks the enemy would never anticipate. The officer emphasized this trait in training and operations. Each mission became a test of creativity and adaptability, ensuring that humans stayed one step ahead whenever possible. The officer also worked to maintain human morale. Soldiers were tired, engineers overworked, and civilians anxious. Fear was natural, but it could not dominate. The officer visited colonies, listened to concerns, and offered reassurance. They emphasized the importance of courage, teamwork, and hope. Humans needed to believe that survival was possible, and every small victory reinforced that belief. One critical operation involved a daring strike on a Karthik communication hub. Engineers had developed a device to disrupt their signals temporarily, while pilots executed a complex series of maneuvers to avoid detection. The officer coordinated the mission with precision, adapting plans as new information came in. The result was a partial disruption of enemy coordination, allowing humans to rescue trapped civilians and repair damaged stations. It was a small but significant success, showing that ingenuity and careful planning could turn the tide, even if only slightly. Despite these successes, the officer knew the war was far from over. The Karthik were adaptive, intelligent, and relentless. Every gain humans achieved would be met with a response, and each step forward required constant vigilance. But the officer also knew that humans had proven something important. They could learn, adapt, and survive. Ingenuity, courage, and teamwork were weapons just as potent as lasers or shields, and they could be used again and again. The officer often spent late nights reviewing strategies, analyzing failures, and planning future operations. Every engagement provided lessons. Every encounter revealed weaknesses or strengths. Humans were learning at a pace the Karthik might not expect. The officer emphasized the importance of observation, analysis, and rapid adaptation. Survival required not just courage, but intelligence applied creatively under pressure. As humans continued to innovate, the Karthik grew more cautious. They had faced unexpected tactics, clever traps, and bold maneuvers. The officer noted that even the deadliest species could be forced to adapt. Humans were gaining experience, building confidence, and demonstrating that they could challenge an enemy that had once seemed unstoppable. At the same time, the officer encouraged everyone to remember why they fought. Civilians, colonists, and soldiers were all part of humanity's effort. Their courage, cooperation, and resourcefulness mattered as much as weapons and ships. The officer understood that war was not just about defeating the enemy. It was about protecting people, communities, and the possibility of a future. This human-centered approach became the foundation for every mission. In the weeks that followed, human ingenuity continued to shape the war. Drones scouted ahead of fleets, deceptive signals misled the enemy, and creative strategies allowed humans to rescue civilians and repair colonies under fire. Each operation tested human courage and intelligence, but every success reinforced the belief that survival was possible. The officer watched as humans became stronger, smarter, and more adaptable with every engagement. The officer also understood the importance of reflection. Every mission, every victory, and every loss provided lessons that could improve the next operation. Humans had to learn quickly, adapt constantly, and use every tool at their disposal. Ingenuity was not just an advantage, it was essential for survival. The officer encouraged teams to share ideas, test unconventional tactics, and remain flexible. The more humans adapted, the stronger they became. The war had reached a critical point. Months of small victories, careful planning, and relentless adaptation had given humans a fragile edge, but the Karthik were relentless. They were faster, stronger, and more precise than anything humans had encountered before. Every day brought new attacks, new challenges, and new losses. The officer knew that to survive, humanity could not simply react. They had to strike decisively and take a bold risk that could change the course of the war. Intelligence reports revealed a vulnerability. A Karthak command hub located in a distant star system, heavily guarded but central to their operations. If humans could strike effectively, they could cripple the enemy's coordination, creating an opportunity for the colonies and allied forces to regroup and strengthen defenses. It was a risky plan, perhaps the most dangerous operation humans had attempted so far. But the officer knew it was necessary. Waiting or retreating would only allow the Karthak to regain the initiative and continue devastating human outposts. The officer gathered the best pilots, engineers, and strategists in a secure command center. The atmosphere was tense but focused. Everyone understood the stakes. One miscalculation could destroy ships, lives, or the entire mission. Plans were reviewed and revised countless times. Every possible scenario was considered, and contingencies were prepared. The officer emphasized teamwork, communication, and adaptability. Every human action had to be precise, coordinated, and clever. Failure was not an option, and every person present understood that the plan relied on a combination of ingenuity, speed, and surprise. Drones and decoy ships would be deployed to mislead Karthik sensors and draw attention away from the main fleet. Pilots would use complex maneuvers to enter the system undetected, while engineers prepared devices to disrupt Karthik communications temporarily. Every element of the operation depended on precision, timing, and human creativity. The officer reminded everyone that the Karthak were intelligent and adaptive, and any mistake could be fatal. The fleet launched in the dead of night, moving quietly through space. The officer remained in the command ship, coordinating movements, monitoring communications, and tracking the progress of every unit. Nervous energy ran through the crew, but there was also determination. Humans had survived impossible odds before, and now they had a chance to turn the tide. The officer kept reminding them, courage, intelligence, and focus would be the keys to success. As the fleet approached the star system, tension grew. Karthak patrols were more numerous than expected, and early encounters tested human skill and strategy. Drones darted through the chaos, drawing enemy attention and creating openings. Pilots executed daring maneuvers, weaving through asteroid fields and enemy fire to reach key positions. Every movement was calculated, yet flexible, ready to adapt to unexpected changes. The officer's heart pounded as reports came in. Some ships were damaged, but no one had been lost yet. Each small success felt monumental. The human fleet reached the command hub with careful precision. Energy shields flared as the Karthak detected them, but decoy signals confused sensors just long enough for the main fleet to enter the system. The officer coordinated attacks on multiple points simultaneously. Engineers activated devices to disrupt communications, while pilots struck at weakly defended positions. Explosions shook the hub, and flashes of light lit the surrounding space. The Karthak were caught off guard, and the humans pressed the advantage. The officers' focus never wavered. Orders were given, adjustments made, and contingencies activated. Every pilot, engineer, and strategist acted with precision and determination. Even under fire, humans worked together, adapting to new challenges. The Karthik fought back fiercely, but the combination of ingenuity, planning, and courage gave humans the upper hand. It was a battle of wits as much as weapons, and for the first time, humans felt they might actually outsmart the galaxy's deadliest species. Amid the chaos, one small human team executed a daring maneuver. Using a combination of stealth and clever tactics, they managed to disable a key communication node within the hub. Instantly, the Karthak fleet coordination faltered. Attacks slowed, formations broke, and confusion spread among their ranks. The officer allowed a brief, quiet smile. This was the turning point they had been waiting for. Humanity had not only survived, they had taken control of the battle, at least temporarily. With the hub disrupted, humans rescued civilians trapped on nearby colonies. Transport ships moved quickly, dodging remaining Karthak fire and returning families to safety. Every successful rescue was a reminder of why the humans fought. The officer watched as families reunited, knowing that these victories were about more than territory or resources. They were about life, hope, and the survival of humanity itself. The battle was far from over. The Karthak regrouped quickly, adapting to human tactics. Attacks resumed with renewed intensity, but the humans were ready. They anticipated movements, set traps, and used every trick they had learned over the past months. The officer directed the fleet with calm authority, balancing boldness with caution. Every decision mattered, and every small success contributed to the larger strategy dot as the battle raged. Humans discovered something extraordinary. The Karthak, who had seemed unstoppable, could be challenged when humans combined courage, creativity, and intelligence. Each unexpected maneuver, clever diversion, or daring strike forced the enemy to rethink their strategy. For the first time, humans realized that the Karthak were not invincible. They were strong and deadly, but they were not infallible. The officer also faced difficult choices. Some ships were damaged, and some crews were exhausted. Supplies were running low, and the enemy remained relentless. Decisions had to be made quickly. Which units to risk, which paths to take, and which opportunities to seize. Every choice carried weight. The officer reminded themselves that leadership was not just about strategy. It was about protecting lives while achieving the mission. Each person's safety was as important as every tactical victory. Hours passed like minutes. The battle pushed humans to their limits, testing every skill they had learned. Pilots executed maneuvers that once seemed impossible. Engineers repaired critical systems under fire, and strategists adapted plans on the fly. The officer watched. Every report, every transmission, every movement, knowing that success depended on focus, courage, and teamwork. Finally, the tide began to turn decisively. The Karthak command hub was severely damaged, their communications disrupted, and their fleet coordination broken. The humans pressed the advantage, striking decisively and rescuing more civilians. It was the first time in the war that humans had clearly gained the upper hand. The officer allowed themselves a moment of relief, though they knew the battle was not entirely over. Every gain had to be secured, and every new plan carefully considered. After the engagement, humans regrouped. Ships were repaired, casualties tended to, and intelligence analyzed. The officer reviewed every detail, learning from both successes and mistakes. The turning point had been achieved, but the officer understood that the Karthak would adapt. They were relentless, intelligent, and unforgiving. Humanity had a temporary advantage, but the war was far from finished. Still, the operation boosted human morale immensely. Soldiers, engineers, pilots, and civilians alike felt a renewed sense of purpose. The officer visited colonies personally, seeing the relief and gratitude in the eyes of people who had survived. Families had been reunited, towns defended, and hope restored. These victories were not just about strategy, they were about preserving life and showing that humans could fight intelligently, bravely, and effectively. The officer also emphasized the lessons learned. Ingenuity, courage, and adaptability had been the keys to this success. Conventional tactics alone would not have worked. Humans had survived, adapted, and found ways to challenge a species that had seemed unbeatable. The officer shared these lessons with all eyes, ensuring that knowledge was passed on and future operations would build on this success. Even in victory, caution remained. The officer knew that the Karthik would retaliate, that they would learn from their mistakes and come back stronger. Preparations began immediately for future defenses and attacks. Humans could celebrate, but they could not become complacent. The officer reminded everyone that survival in this war required constant vigilance, intelligence, and courage. At the end of the day, as stars stretched endlessly across space, the officer reflected on the battle. Humanity had faced the deadliest species in the galaxy and had emerged, for the first time, with a decisive advantage. It was a turning point, not just in strategy, but in confidence. Humans had learned that they could fight, adapt, and win against overwhelming odds. Courage, ingenuity, and determination had proven stronger than fear, and that realization would guide them in the battles ahead. The officer knew the war was not over. The Karthik were still out there, still powerful, and still relentless. But humanity had proven something vital. Even against the most lethal enemy, courage, creativity, and teamwork could turn the tide. Every human action, every clever tactic, every brave decision had contributed to this moment. And with each step, humans grew stronger, smarter, and more determined to survive. The turning point had been achieved, but the war would continue. The battle had changed everything. The humans had survived against a species that had seemed unstoppable, and for the first time, they had gained a real advantage. But the officer knew that survival did not mean the war was over. The Karthik were intelligent, relentless, and quick to adapt. Even after the recent victories, caution was essential. The officer's mind never rested, always planning, analyzing, and anticipating the enemy's next moves. Human colonies were damaged, and the cost had been high. Ships had been destroyed, and many brave lives had been lost. Yet, despite the losses, there was a renewed sense of hope. Civilians began rebuilding, engineers repaired critical systems, and soldiers trained for the challenges that lay ahead. The officer walked through one of the main colonies, observing the efforts firsthand. Families worked together to rebuild homes, children played among the ruins, and communities organized to share food and supplies. In every effort, the resilience of humanity was clear. The officer understood that morale was as important as strategy. Survivors needed to believe that their sacrifices had meaning, that life would continue, and that humans could thrive even in the face of a deadly enemy. Messages of encouragement were sent across colonies and fleets, emphasizing bravery, teamwork, and perseverance. Small celebrations marked successes: each repaired ship, each rescued group of civilians, each defended colony. These moments of joy reminded humans of what they were fighting for: life, hope, and the possibility of a future. The officer also focused on consolidating alliances. Other species that had aided humanity in previous battles remained cautious but curious. The recent victories proved that humans could adapt, strategize, and fight effectively. Collaborative efforts increased with engineers, pilots, and strategists from multiple species working together. They shared knowledge, tested new tactics, and coordinated future operations. Trust grew slowly but steadily, creating a network of support that would be essential in the ongoing conflict with the Karthik. One of the most critical lessons learned was the importance of intelligence. Human teams continued to monitor Karthak movements, gathering data from skirmishes, drones, and allied reconnaissance. Every observation provided insight into enemy strategies, weaknesses, and tendencies. The officer emphasized the careful analysis of this information, reminding everyone that understanding the enemy was as vital as any weapon. Every detail, no matter how small, could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Despite the victories, the Karthik did not retreat entirely. Their attacks became more sporadic but unpredictable. They tested defenses, probed weak points, and occasionally struck suddenly. These strikes reminded humans that the enemy remained formidable and that complacency could be deadly. The officer reinforced discipline and vigilance, ensuring that humans remained alert and prepared for anything. Adaptability had become humanity's greatest strength, and it would continue to guide every action. The officer also prioritized rebuilding and improving human defenses. Damaged colonies were fortified, supply lines strengthened, and new technologies implemented. Engineers worked tirelessly to create improved shields, faster ships, and more advanced communication systems. Pilots practiced new maneuvers, while strategists developed flexible plans for defense and offense. Every effort focused on ensuring that humans were not just surviving, but growing stronger and smarter in preparation for future encounters. Amid these preparations, the officer encouraged humans to reflect on the war so far. Lessons from each battle were studied carefully. Mistakes were acknowledged and corrected, while successful strategies were refined and shared. The officer held briefings and training sessions, emphasizing that every human, whether soldier, engineer, or civilian, had a role to play. Courage, intelligence, teamwork, and adaptability were the most powerful tools humanity had, and everyone needed to understand how to use them effectively. Communities began to recover. Farmers replanted fields, technicians repaired power grids, and schools reopened. Civilians who had once been paralyzed by fear now contributed to defense efforts and rebuilding projects. Volunteers repaired ships, delivered supplies, and assisted in training recruits. The officer observed these efforts with quiet satisfaction. Survival depended not just on soldiers and weapons, it depended on the resilience, creativity, and determination of every human being. As months passed, humans also began to study Karthik behavior more closely. Analysts noticed patterns in attacks, communication methods, and fleet movements. These insights allowed humans to anticipate enemy strategies and respond more effectively. Small victories accumulated into larger successes, reinforcing morale and confidence. The officer reminded everyone that every observation, every piece of intelligence, strengthened humanity's position and increased the chance of long-term survival. Even in quiet moments, the officer remained vigilant. The stars beyond the colonies were vast and filled with potential threats. Karthik ships could appear suddenly, and intelligence indicated they continued to adapt. Humans had learned that every advantage came from preparation, observation, and careful execution. The officer ensured that vigilance remained constant, knowing that survival was built on awareness, flexibility, and courage. The officer also encouraged creativity and problem-solving. Engineers developed new defense systems, pilots tested unconventional tactics, and strategists explored innovative ways to protect colonies and civilians. This culture of ingenuity became a hallmark of human resistance. Unlike the Karthik, who relied heavily on predictability and calculated strategies, humans could improvise, adapt, and think outside the box. Every creative solution increased the odds of survival and demonstrated that intelligence, and courage could rival raw power. Humanity's recent victories inspired renewed training efforts. Recruits learned advanced maneuvers, engineers practiced emergency repairs under pressure, and pilots simulated complex engagements. The officer emphasized teamwork and communication, ensuring that every human understood their role in the larger effort. Humans had survived through ingenuity and courage, and preparation ensured that these strengths would continue to protect colonies and fleets in the future. The officer also focused on the human spirit. Stories of bravery, clever tactics, and successful rescues were shared widely. Civilians and soldiers alike drew inspiration from these examples, understanding that courage and resourcefulness could change outcomes even in dire situations. Every story, every shared experience, reinforced the idea that humans were not helpless victims, but active participants capable of influencing the course of events. Alliances continued to strengthen. Other species saw humanity's resilience, intelligence, and adaptability, and cooperation deepened. Engineers shared designs, pilots exchanged tactics, and strategists coordinated plans. Mutual respect grew, and trust became a foundation for future operations. The officer understood that humanity could not survive alone, and these partnerships provided both practical support and a psychological boost. Proving that humans were capable allies in the galactic struggle, the officer also addressed the psychological toll of war. Many humans were exhausted, fearful, or grieving. Counseling programs were established, support networks created, and community gatherings encouraged. Humans learned that courage was not the absence of fear, it was acting despite fear. By supporting one another, humans strengthened morale, resilience, and unity. Every recovered individual, every community that rebuilt itself, became a testament to human strength and determination. As humans repaired colonies and prepared for future encounters, the officer continued to emphasize lessons learned. Observation, creativity, teamwork, and adaptability were central to survival. Humans were reminded that the Karthik would continue to strike, and victory required intelligence, courage, and careful planning. Every mission, every repair, every training exercise was a step toward ensuring that humans remained prepared, resilient, and capable of defending themselves and their allies. In quiet reflection, the officer considered the journey so far. Humanity had faced the deadliest species in the galaxy, endured losses, adapted, and learned. Every challenge had strengthened humans, teaching them to survive and fight intelligently. Courage, creativity, and cooperation had become the most powerful weapons, proving that even in the darkest moments, humans could rise to meet the challenge. The officer also thought about the future. The Karthik remained out there, formidable and intelligent, but humanity had proven that survival and success were possible. Every victory, every lesson learned, and every strengthened alliance contributed to a growing sense of hope. Humans were no longer simply surviving. They were preparing to thrive in a galaxy that had once seemed overwhelmingly hostile. The officer encouraged humans to carry this hope forward. Every community, every fleet, every individual had a role to play. Courage, intelligence, and ingenuity would continue to be essential in the ongoing struggle. Humans had demonstrated that they could challenge the Karthik, adapt to impossible situations, and protect one another. These qualities, the officer knew, would define humanity's strength in the battles yet to come. Humanity's story was no longer one of fear and helplessness. It was a story of resilience, adaptation, and courage, even in the face of a species more powerful and